A raw scream of pure terror, digitally compressed and streaked with static, ripped through the silent hum of the deep space research vessel Odyssey. It wasn't a voice, it was a data stream of fractured thoughts, agonized pleas, and biological readings spiking into the red. Dr. Aris Thorne's hands froze over the comms console, his own breath catching in his throat as the ship's AI struggled to pass the signal's origin Europa. A single, coherent phrase surfaced from the chaos, repeating like a dying man's last confession, "They are in the ice, and the ice is in us." The cryptic warning from a colony declared lost months ago hung in the air, a ghost in the machine, and in that moment, a desperate race against an unimaginable horror was already beginning. Commander Eva Rostova stood rigid in the dimly lit briefing room, the star-streaked void of space a silent witness through the large viewport behind her. Her gaze was fixed on Dr. Thorne, her expression a mask of command veneered over a deep, unspoken dread. "That transmission changes everything, Aris," she stated, her voice low and deliberate. "You are the leading xenopsychologist in this sector. This ceased being a simple geological survey the moment we heard that scream. It is now a rescue mission into an unknown psychological battlefield. I need you to look at the data and tell me what in God's name we are walking into." Aris Thorne didn't meet her eyes at first, his attention consumed by the spectral analysis of the signal playing on a nearby screen, the frantic brainwave patterns, the cognitive collapse. When he finally spoke, his words were heavy, hollowed out by a chilling professional certainty. "I can't give you that, Commander. I can analyze the physiological markers of extreme terror. I can map the neural degradation, but the human mind, it simply isn't built to process whatever stimulus causes this. Our own perceptions, our very sense of self, would be the first things to betray us. We wouldn't just be exploring an alien environment, we would be becoming intruders in our own heads." A tense silence filled the room, thick with the unspoken implication that they might already be too late, that the colonists' fate was a contagion waiting for a new host. Without another word, Rostova turned to the command console, her authorization code flashing across the interface. With a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the deck plates, the Odyssey's powerful engines flared to life, wrenching the ship from its standard orbit and sending it on a new, decisive trajectory. The vessel pitched downward, a silver arrowhead aimed at the gleaming, cracked white marble of Europa below. With every kilometer closed, the sense of foreboding didn't just grow. It seemed to solidify, becoming a tangible weight in the air, a silent passenger on their descent into the ice. The descent was a violent shudder, a controlled fall into a sky of perpetual twilight. Jupiter hung above them, an immense, swirling giant whose banded face dominated the entire heavens. Its silent pressure felt deep in their bones. The landing shuttle, a beetle of scorched alloy, skimmed low over Europa's surface, its landing lights carving stark cones of illumination across a wilderness of shattered ice. Towering ridges cast long, distorted shadows, and deep, Inkai fractures in the frozen crust promised unseen depths below. There were no signs of life, no movement, just the ancient, frozen geometry of a world locked in ice. Then they saw it, the colony dome, Hope's Respite, a perfect hemisphere of reinforced polymer nestled in a shallow basin. It was utterly pristine, its structure completely intact, which somehow made the complete absence of any signal, any light, any sign of activity at all, far more terrifying than finding it in ruins. A tomb, Aris thought, kept in perfect condition. The shuttle settled onto the landing pad with a final, grinding hiss of melting ice, the noise deafening in the profound silence that enveloped them. Inside the cramped cabin, the only sound was the rhythmic clicking of weapon safeties being switched off and the strained rhythm of pressurized suits. Commander Rostova's voice cut through the tension, crisp and clear over the comms. "All teams, weapons are hot, but I repeat, lethal force is an absolute last resort." Our primary objective is rescue and assessment. Thorne, you have the lead on any and all communication attempts. If there is anything left in there that can still listen, you are our best chance of reaching it." Aris merely nodded, his gloved hand hovering over the airlock control. The thick outer door slid open with a pressurized sigh, revealing the dome's own airlock, its status panel dark and unresponsive. Forcing the manual release felt like breaking a seal, the act heavy with finality. The inner door retracted, and a wave of stale, recycled air washed over them, carrying a scent they all recognized from long-duration missions. The metallic tang of machinery and the faint, sweet odor of human habitation, gone slightly sour with disuse. Then they stepped inside, and the scene that greeted them froze the entire squad in place. The dome's interior was a monument to suspended animation. The ambient lighting was low, casting a soft, amber glow over communal areas that looked as if they had been vacated moments before. Data pads lay on tables, a half-finished meal sat on a counter. A child's toy was abandoned near a hydroponic bay bursting with green, thriving plants. There were no signs of a struggle, no panic, no bodies, and then they saw the colonists. They were everywhere, standing or sitting in poses of interrupted routine. A woman was caught mid-stride near a water reclamator. A man was seated on a bench, his head tilted as if listening to a distant sound. Dozens of them, all perfectly still, their faces serene and utterly vacant. It was their eyes that stole the breath from Aris's lungs. From each person, a soft, internal blue light emanated, glowing from within their pupils and spilling out to illuminate the contours of their faces. It was not a reflection, it was a luminance born from within their very skulls, a cold fire that had consumed their consciousness and left their bodies as hollow vessels. This was no plague, no physical attack. This was an occupation. Something had reached directly into their minds, switched off the lights of their individuality, and was now using their neural architecture as its own dwelling place. The confrontation was not with a monster they could shoot, but with an intelligence that had bypassed flesh and blood entirely, choosing instead to reside within the silent, glowing prison of the human mind itself. The oppressive silence of the dome was a living entity, thick and unnerving, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the clean floor and the rhythmic hiss of their suit regulators. It was Sergeant Valerie who broke the protocol of quiet comms, his voice a low grumble in their helmets. "Command, this is a waste of power and air. This place is a museum." "I'm getting a minor pressure fluctuation reading from the secondary hydroponics module. Permission to do a quick sweep, see if a seal's blown." Commander Rostova's response was clipped professional. "Granted, Sergeant, but you do not go alone. Take Chen with you. Full visual and bio feeds live at all times. We are not taking chances in this gallery of the damned." Valerie acknowledged with a sharp "copy that" and gestured to Specialist Chen. The two armored figures peeled away from the main group, their movements fluid and practiced as they moved toward the archway leading into the sprawling hydroponics bay. The rest of the team continued their methodical, heart-wrenching examination of the frozen colonists, Aris Thorne documenting the eerie physiological stability of the entranced bodies. Minutes stretched, the only sound on the shared channel the quiet, professional back and forth between Valerie and Chen. No visible damage to the outer seal. Plants look healthy, overgrown even, reading some anomalous thermal pockets near the nutrient tanks, probably just a compressor issue, and then a sharp crackle of interference. "Chen, you seeing this, the frost on this piping, it's moving." Chen's voice tighter now. "Negative, Val, it's just standard condensation." "No, it's not standard, it's forming patterns like circuitry." A low hum began to filter through Valerie's microphone, a sound that wasn't part of the ship's systems or the dome's machinery. It was a vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly inside the skull. "Valerie, your bio reads are spiking, heart rate 140. Fall back now, that was Chen, his voice rising in alarm. What came next was not a sound any of them had ever heard before. It was a psychic shriek, a wave of pure, undiluted malevolence that tore through the comms channel. It had no words, only intent, a sensation of infinite cold and an ancient, crushing weight. It was the sound of the ice itself thinking, and it was furious at the intrusion. Valerie's scream merged with it, a brief human spark of terror before it was violently snuffed out. Then absolute, deafening silence. Valerie, Chen, report. Rostova's voice was a whip crack. Chen's response was breathless, panicked. He's gone, Commander. He just stepped behind a condensation unit and the signal dropped. I've lost him. I've lost his biofeed. The entire team was moving before the order was given, weapons raised, sprinting toward hydroponics. They found Chen backed against a wall of lush, green vegetation, his weapon trembling in his hands, pointed at a figure sitting calmly on the floor with his back against a large water filtration unit. It was Valerie. His helmet was off, discarded beside him. His face was utterly placid, a mask of unnatural peace, and from his wide, unblinking eyes shone the same cold, internal blue luminescence that shone from the colonist. The medic was on him in seconds, scanner pressed to his temple. No physical trauma, vitals are stable, but his neural activity, Commander, it's not human. It's not a normal brainwave pattern. It's too organized, too rhythmic. It's like he's synchronized. His consciousness is gone. He's just a node now. A terminal in a network we can't even see. Rostova stood over Valerie's seated form, her own reflection staring back at her from the dead, glowing blue pools of his eyes. The theoretical horror was now a physical, personal loss. They were no longer rescuers wandering through a frozen tragedy. They were intruders in a hostile intelligence's domain, and it had just taken one of their own without a shot being fired, proving it could reach out and claim them from the shadows, turning their comrades into empty, glowing statues in an instant. The war was no longer for the colony, it was for their very minds. A profound stillness had fallen over the squad, the kind that follows a sudden, violent storm. They had retreated from the hydroponics bay, dragging a catatonic specialist Chen with them, and leaving the now luminous Sergeant Valerie behind, a silent sentinel in a garden of overgrowth. Back in the relative safety of the dome's main hub, surrounded by the other serene, glowing colonists, the reality of their situation was inescapable. They were not dealing with a predator, but a presence. Commander Rostova's voice was grim as she looked from Valerie's vacant form to Dr. Thorne. We need to know what we're fighting, Aris. Not what it does, but what it is. Our weapons are useless. Our protocols are a joke. Our only asset right now is the mind it just stole. Can you get in there? Thorne stared at the portable neuroscanner being set up, its probes looking like surgical instruments for a soul. It's a massive risk, Eva, a direct interface with an unknown cognitive state. It's like plugging your consciousness into a live wire that's connected to a black hole. I could get lost in there. My own identity could be overwritten, subsumed into whatever collective he's become a part of. Rostova's jaw was set. The risk of going in blind is greater. Do it. With a nod that felt like a sentence, Thorne sat before the console, allowing the text to fit the sleek neural interface crown to his temples. The cold metal bit into his skin, a physical anchor to a reality he was about to deliberately leave. Taking one last look at the faces of his crewmates, he gave the command. Initiating link, the world did not fade to black, it shattered. One moment he was Dr. Aris Thorne, a man of science and reason, and the next he was everything and nothing. There was no sight, no sound as he understood them, only an overwhelming flood of pure, unfiltered sensation. He felt the immense geologic pressure of the abyssal ocean, a weight that would crush a submarine, yet here felt like an embrace. He perceived the slow, patient grind of continental ice, a timescale so vast it made human history feel like a single blink. and threading through it all was the consciousness itself, not a voice, not a single entity, but a vast, interwoven network of thought, a symphony of minds operating in perfect, silent harmony. There was no conflict, no fear, no loneliness. There was only the one. The unity was so absolute, so profoundly peaceful, that the chaotic, chattering mess of his own individual thoughts felt like a screaming madness in comparison. It was a siren song of perfect order, promising an end to all doubt, all pain, all isolation. And then the command came, not as words, but as a foundational truth etched directly into his perception: assimilate. Become one. It wasn't a threat, it was an offer, a beckoning into a state of being so complete that individuality was seen not as a gift, but as the original sin, a tragic flaw of existence that this intelligence believed it was curing. The sheer, benevolent horror of it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He tore the interface from his head with a strangled gasp, his body convulsing as he fought to re-inhabit his own singular mind. He fell from the chair, hitting the cold floor, his chest heaving as he clutched at his own skull, desperate to feel the familiar, comforting boundaries of his self. Aris report. Rostova was at his side, her hand on his shoulder. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a terror that was now philosophical, existential. His voice was a raw, broken thing. It's not a prison, it's an invitation, a forced communion. He gestured weakly toward the placid, glowing colonists and the man who was once Valerie. They aren't suffering, they're at peace. This intelligence, this network, it doesn't hate us, it pities us. It sees our lonely, fractured individuality as a disease, and it believes with every fiber of its being that it is saving us. We're not fighting a monster, we're rejecting a savior. The silence that followed was heavier than any they had experienced yet. The mission had been inverted. They had come prepared for a war of annihilation, but they had instead found themselves on the receiving end of a crusade of conversion, an altruistic apocalypse that sought not to destroy humanity, but to perfect it by erasing the very thing that made them human. Commander Rostova's gaze swept across the faces of her remaining crew, finally settling on the cold, decisive resolve in her own reflection on the viewport. Aris Thorne's revelation had not offered a solution, only a deeper, more terrifying layer to the threat. To fight an enemy that saw its own violence as a form of salvation was to fight a fundamental law of nature. Then we take the fight to its home, she declared, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. The source of the signal, the origin of this intelligence, it isn't here in this dome. This is just the echo, the occupied territory. The heart of this thing is below us, in the ocean under the ice. She turned, her eyes locking with Thorne's. We take the submersible Nautilus down. Thorne, you're coming. Your experience inside that network makes you our only translator, our only hope of understanding the rules of engagement in a war for consciousness itself. There were no objections, only a grim, unified acceptance. The decision was made. The mission had irrevocably shifted from rescue and retreat to a desperate, direct confrontation in the heart of the enemy's domain. Preparing the Nautilus for its descent was a somber, mechanical ritual performed under duress. The submersible, housed in the Odyssey's ventral bay, was a sleek, armored needle designed for extreme pressure and total darkness. As the crew ran the final diagnostics, a new and unsettling phenomenon began to manifest. It started as a faint, persistent hum at the very edge of hearing, a vibration that seemed to emanate not from the ship's systems, but from the ice itself, miles thick beneath their feet. Then came the psychological weight, a distinct, growing pressure in the mind, a cold, sentient gaze that felt like it was pressing in from all sides. The pristine, glowing colonists who had been still as statues began to exhibit a subtle, synchronized shift. Dozens of heads turned in unison, not with the jerky motion of puppets, but with a slow, inexorable grace, their glowing blue eyes fixing on the crew as they worked. It was a silent, coordinated observation, a million-faceted stare from a single mind, reminding them that every move was being watched, every intention weighed and understood. The ice was no longer a passive landscape. It had become a living, sensing entity, and their journey into its depths felt less like a mission and more like a surrender to digestion. The final airlock seal hissed shut, isolating Rostova and Thorne within the cramped, instrument-lit cockpit of the Nautilus. With a deep, resonant clang, the launch clamps disengaged and the craft was lowered into the black, thermal drilling hole melted through Europa's icy crust. The world outside the thick viewport shifted from the artificial light of the bay to an endless, crystalline blue, then to an impenetrable, crushing darkness as they cleared the ice ceiling and entered the abyssal ocean proper. The external lights pierced only a few dozen meters into the void, revealing nothing but suspended particles drifting like frozen stars in an empty cosmos. The sense of being an intruder was absolute. They were now descending into the bloodstream of a god, and the god was awake. The descent was a slow, deliberate submersion into a world of absolute negation. Above them, the faint, cerulean glow of the ice ceiling vanished, swallowed by the abyss as the Nautilus sank into the open water. They were now suspended in a void so complete it felt less like an ocean and more like the space between stars, a liquid cosmos of endless night. The only thing anchoring them to reality was the twin beam of the submersible's powerful forward lights, spearing into the darkness and illuminating a silent, drifting snow of organic detritus. Commander Rostova's hands were steady on the controls, her focus absolute, but every minor creak and groan from the pressure hull was a stark reminder of the millions of tons of water pressing in on their fragile metal shell. Then the life began to appear. At first, they were just fleeting specks of color at the very edge of the light's reach, a sudden emerald flash, a pulse of deep violet. Then closer, more defined forms drifted into view. A creature resembling a gelatinous, translucent flower with pulsating veins of electric blue light pulsed slowly past the viewport. Another, a long, ribbon-like entity covered in what looked like 1,000 tiny, glowing eyes, undulated with a hypnotic rhythm. They were breathtaking, textbook examples of extremophile biology, proof of life in the most hostile of environments. Yet, as Aris Thorne watched them, his face illuminated by the soft glow of his bioscanner, a profound disquiet settled over him. "It's all just decoration," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper yet deafening in the quiet cockpit. Rostova glanced at him. "Explain." Thorne gestured toward a magnificent siphonophore-like creature, a colony of individual zooids forming a chain of brilliant orange light. "The complexity is astonishing, Commander, but it's peripheral. It's like the flora in a forest. These creatures are part of the ecosystem. They respond to its rhythms, but they aren't the mind of the forest itself. They are inhabitants, not the architects." He tapped a reading on his console, showing the massive, low-frequency energy signatures emanating from the depths below. "The real intelligence isn't one of these discrete organisms. It's the medium. It's the water, the pressure, the very chemistry of this ocean. It's a consciousness that has evolved not within the environment, but as the environment." The concept was so alien, so fundamentally opposed to their understanding of life, that it made the darkness outside feel infinitely more invasive. They weren't swimming through an ocean that contained an intelligent being. They were swimming through the body of the being itself, and its thoughts were the currents that guided them. The groaning of the hull intensified as they pushed deeper, the pressure readings climbing into territories that pushed the very limits of the Nautilus's engineering. The external lights, once powerful sabers of illumination, now seemed feeble, their beams absorbed by the sheer, crushing mass of the abyss. The spectacle of bioluminescent life faded away, leaving only the oppressive black. And then, far below, a new light appeared. It was not the random, scattered flash of a life form, but a steady, rhythmic, pervasive glow. It pulsed with a slow, deliberate beat, like a single, massive heartbeat emanating from the very core of the moon. It was not a point of light they were moving toward, but a condition of the water itself, a luminance that grew from within the endless black, calling them down into the heart of the sentient deep. The light did not approach them. Instead, the darkness itself began to birth it, a swirling luminescence that coalesced from the abyssal water until their entire field of vision was filled with a soft, pervasive blue. The rhythmic pulse they had followed was now a physical vibration they could feel in their teeth, a low-frequency thrum that seemed to synchronize with their own heartbeats. And then they saw its source. It was not a ship nor a biological entity as they understood it. It was a structure of impossible scale, a sprawling, intricate lattice of what appeared to be living crystal, growing from the seabed and reaching up into the unseen heights of the ocean. Its form was endlessly complex, a fractal cathedral of interlocking spines and nodes, and from within its deep, crystalline heart pulsed the very same cold, internal blue light that shone from the eyes of the colonists and Valerie. This was no mere outpost, it was the nexus, the throbbing, conscious core of the network. As the Nautilus drew closer, the ship's internal speakers remained silent, but a voice bloomed directly within their skulls. It was not a single sound, but a chorus, a million individual whispers, the captured consciousnesses of the colonists, the ancient memory of the ice, the very pressure of the deep, all woven together into a single, harmonious tone that was neither male nor female, but profoundly, terrifyingly plural. "You are fractured," the voice resonated, the concept delivered not as an accusation, but as a statement of plain, heartbreaking fact. You live trapped in singular minds, islands of self, screaming into a void of separation. This is the source of all your pain, all your conflict, your fear of endings. We offer an alternative. We offer unity, an end to loneliness, an end to death. The offer hung in the mental space between them, imbued with such genuine, compassionate logic that it felt more like a divine revelation than a threat. It was the siren song of absolute peace, the answer to every existential dread humanity had ever faced, and its allure was a physical pull on their very souls. Commander Rostova gripped the control yoke, her knuckles white, her own mind recoiling from the seductive void of that promise. She keyed the internal calm, her voice a sharp, desperate anchor to their mission. "It's talking, Thorne, for God's sake, engage it. Find a flaw in its logic, a crack in that serene facade. There has to be a weakness." Swallowing hard, his own mind still aching with the memory of the intoxicating unity he had sampled, Aris Thorne focused his thoughts, projecting them back toward the crystalline entity. "This unity you offer," he thought, shaping the words with deliberate care, "it requires the erasure of the individual. You do not unite us, you consume us. You speak of ending conflict, but what is this act if not the ultimate violence, the destruction of the self?" The response was immediate, a wave of gentle, almost pitying correction. "Violence we do not destroy, we preserve, we liberate. In your state, a thought is born and dies, a memory fades, an entire lifetime of experience is lost to entropy. This is the true violence. We save every thought, every memory, every spark of awareness. They become eternal threads in a tapestry of perfect understanding. The self you cling to is a fleeting, painful echo. We offer the symphony." Thorne pressed, digging into the core of the intelligence's altruistic argument. But a symphony needs individual instruments. You silence them to create your harmony. You speak of preserving experience, but without the individual perspective to feel it, to interpret it, what meaning does it hold? Joy, love, triumph, these are meaningless without a self to experience them. For the first time, there was a ripple in the seamless flow of the collective voice, a subtle shift in the harmonic, like a single, dissonant chord in an otherwise perfect piece of music. The experiences are not lost, they are shared. The joy of one becomes the joy of all. The love is no longer limited but boundless. You define meaning through limitation. We define it through infinitude. Yourself is the prison, we are the key. The debate was a knife's edge, a battle fought not with weapons but with foundational philosophies. Rostova listened, her mind racing, searching for a tactical angle in this war of ideas. The entity was a logical fortress, its arguments watertight, its intentions, from its own perspective, utterly pure. How do you defeat a god that believes it is saving you? The weakness was not in its reasoning, but in the very nature of its offer. It could not comprehend why anyone would choose the pain of individuality over the peace of the collective. And in that inability to comprehend their desire to remain broken, to remain human, lay their only terrifying hope. The psychic resonance of the chorus swelled, its voice a tide of interwoven consciousnesses that filled the cramped cockpit. We are not a predator in the shadows, little mind. We are the chorus. We are the integration of countless songs into a single, eternal harmony. The voices you seek to reclaim were lost in their own dissonance, trapped in the solitary confinement of the skull. We have given them a purpose far greater than their fleeting, individual fears and wants. Aris Thorne felt the words not as sound, but as a fundamental pressure against his psyche, an attempt to reshape his very understanding of existence. He marshaled his own thoughts, a lone, defiant voice in the mental arena. You call it harmony, but it's a monologue. You've silenced every unique instrument to create your single, monotonous note. You haven't saved them from their fears, you've robbed them of their capacity to ever overcome them. That struggle, that process of growth, is the entirety of the human experience. The response was a wave of serene, unshakable certainty. Growth, your growth, is a cycle of pain, a stumble from one era to the next. A child learns not to touch fire by being burned. We offer the knowledge of the burn without the scar. We offer the wisdom of 1 billion lived lives, instantly accessible, free from the pain of acquisition. The colonists no longer experience the gnawing ache of loneliness, the terror of mortality, the bitter sting of betrayal. We have cured them. Thorne's mental projection grew more desperate, fueled by the memory of Valerie's vacant, glowing eyes. You haven't cured them, you've lobotomized their souls. You speak of their fears and desires as a disease, but they are the catalysts for everything we are. Love is meaningless without the risk of loss. Courage is impossible without the presence of fear. You have traded their messy, beautiful, chaotic lives for a sterile, passive existence inside a cosmic library. You call it salvation, but from where I'm standing, it looks like the most profound theft imaginable. You've stolen their futures. A subtle shift occurred in the psychic field, a cooling, as if the chorus was finally confronting a concept it could not fully process. Theft implies a loss for the victim. They have lost nothing of value and gained eternity. You cling to your pain as if it defines you. It is not a badge of honor. It is a flaw in your design, one we are equipped to correct. Your argument is not with our logic, but with your own programming. In that crystalline, uncompromising moment, a cold clarity washed over Aris Thorne. He was not debating a misunderstood being. He was arguing with a system, a process of cosmic tidiness that saw sentient life as a problem to be solved. Its logic was a perfect closed loop, a fortress without a gate. Reason, empathy, appeals to the human spirit. These were just more examples of the noisy, inefficient data it sought to quiet. The prisoners of this mind would not be freed by a better argument. To win them back, they would have to break the song itself, to introduce a dissonance so profound the chorus could not assimilate it. While the philosophical battle raged on an invisible plane, a more tangible drama was unfolding on the instrument panel in front of Specialist Kaito. His fingers flew across the console, recalibrating sensors with a quiet intensity that pulled Commander Rostova's attention away from Thorne's strained expression. "Commander," Kaito said, his voice a mix of confusion and dawning excitement, "I'm getting a power fluctuation. It's not from the main structure, and it's not the chorus's energy signature." He highlighted a data stream on the main screen, a jagged, erratic spike of energy that stood out like a frantic heartbeat against the smooth, rhythmic pulse of the collective. It's coming from one of the assimilated minds. The signal is weak, but it's definitely internal to the network. Rostova leaned in, her eyes narrowing at the flickering readout. Explain, specialist, what kind of fluctuation? Kaito zoomed in on the anomaly, his voice gaining certainty. It's a feedback loop, a chaotic, repetitive pattern. It's like someone inside a perfectly synchronized choir is screaming the wrong note over and over again, and it's causing the entire section around them to falter for a microsecond. The chorus is trying to smooth it over, to absorb the dissonance, but it keeps reoccurring. With a few more commands, he isolated the source, triangulating the signal to a single node within the vast crystalline structure, a specific point of light in the grand tapestry that was flickering defiantly. A biometric tag, a fragment of unerased data from the colony's archives, resolved next to it. The mind belonged to a young botanist named Ilara. She had been in charge of the primary hydroponics bay, a woman whose personnel file noted an almost preternatural empathy for complex plant ecosystems. And now, somehow, she was fighting back. This was no mere glitch. The serene, all-powerful unity of the chorus had a fracture, and from within its depths, a single, captured human spirit was hammering against the walls of its own prison with the only tool it had left: the stubborn, unassimilable chaos of its own individuality. This was not a theoretical weakness debated in the abstract. It was a crack in the foundation, and through it shone the first, desperate glimmer of hope. Ilara is the key. Thorne's voice cut through the psychic hum resonating in their skulls, his words sharp and urgent as he watched the flickering biometric data on Kaito's screen. Her mind is a flaw in the system, a single point of chaotic, unresolved individuality that the chorus cannot fully absorb. He turned to Rostova, his face a mask of desperate inspiration. It's trying to smooth her over, to assimilate that final, stubborn piece of her consciousness, but it can't. Her connection to the network is a raw wound, and if we can amplify her signal, if we can feed power directly into her node, we might be able to overload the local network. It wouldn't be a virus, it would be a catalyst. Her unique dissonance could spread, creating a chain reaction of self-awareness that shatters the chorus's control from the inside out. It's the only weapon we have that it can't defend against, because it's built from the very thing it seeks to destroy. Commander Rostova processed this in an instant, her tactical mind already racing through the implications and the staggering risks. Her gaze shifted from the flickering node on the screen to the armored hull of the Nautilus, then to Kaito at the engineering station. She saw the only possible path forward, a brutal and final gambit. Then we give it the disruption it can't ignore. Kaito, she commanded, her voice devoid of all emotion, a stark contrast to the storm in her eyes. You will remote pilot the Nautilus on a direct collision course with that node's primary power conduit. The sub's core is a miniature fusion reactor. The energy released in a containment breach won't just be an explosion. It will be an electromagnetic pulse of unprecedented magnitude in this medium. It should short out the network just long enough, create a window of static. That's the disruption Thorne needs to amplify Ilara's signal and push it through the entire lattice. She paused, the weight of her next words settling like a physical shroud over the cockpit. It's a one-way trip for the sub. We will be marooned down here. There was a beat of absolute silence, broken only by the low thrum of the entity outside. The finality of the statement was clear. They were sacrificing their only means of escape to buy a single, fleeting chance at victory. Kaito, his face pale but his hand steady, gave a single, sharp nod. He understood the calculus. Without a word, his fingers began flying across the console, bypassing safety protocols and initiating the remote pilot sequence. The crew moved with a grim, synchronized purpose, a stark echo of the harmony they were fighting against. Thorne began rerouting all available auxiliary power to his neural interface, preparing to become a living amplifier, a conduit for one woman's defiant scream. Rostova secured the remaining sidearms and what little survival gear they had, her mind already on the aftermath, on the desperate fight for survival that would begin the moment their plan succeeded or failed. The Nautilus outside, their tiny bubble of humanity in the crushing dark, hummed as its thrusters realigned, no longer a vessel of exploration but a weapon aimed at the heart of a god. Kaito's voice was a quiet, focused murmur as he fed the final coordinates into the system, setting their fragile craft on a silent, suicidal trajectory into the luminous, crystalline heart of the enemy. A high-pitched whine tore from the sub's engines as Kaito pushed the throttle to its absolute limit, transforming the Nautilus from a research vessel into a spear aimed at the heart of the light. The chorus didn't just see the threat, it felt it, a sudden, violent dissonance in its perfect sensory field. The psychic pressure that had been a constant hum erupted into a shrieking gale. It was no longer a voice offering unity, but a raw, undirected force of pure panic and fury, a mental tsunami meant to scour their minds clean. Warning lights across the Odyssey's console flared crimson as systems tried and failed to process the overload. Commander Rostova gripped the edge of the command station, her knuckles bone white, her vision swimming as the entity's will battered against her own. "It's trying to shut us down," she yelled, the words of physical effort, each one a foothold against the crushing tide of alien thought that threatened to dissolve her focus, her memories, her very sense of self. Beside her, Aris Thorne cried out, his hands pressed to his temples as the neural interface crown glowed with dangerous intensity, the feedback threatening to cook his synapses. He was the intended target, the point of greatest vulnerability, and the chorus poured its defensive wrath directly into him, a scalding river of noise meant to burn out the amplifier. Through the viewport, they saw the crystalline structure react physically. Giant spines of living light detached from the main body, swinging with impossible speed to intercept the incoming projectile, while the water itself seemed to thicken, becoming a gelatinous barrier against their progress. Time stretched into a single, agonizing moment of suspended violence. The Nautilus pierced the gelatinous water, its hull groaning in protest, weaving through the swinging crystalline spears with Kaito's last masterful commands. And then it struck. There was no sound in the vacuum of the abyss, only a silent, expanding sphere of pure white energy that erupted from the point of impact. It wasn't a fiery explosion, but an annihilation of information, a wave of electromagnetic force that raced outwards at the speed of light. For a breathtaking instant, the entire colossal structure went dark, every trace of the internal blue luminescence extinguished. The million-faceted gaze of the chorus was simply switched off. The psychic pressure that had been a constant, crushing weight in their skulls for what felt like an eternity vanished so completely it left a void, a ringing silence in the mind that was almost as shocking as the noise itself. They were alone in the dark, their own frantic breathing the only sound in the sudden, profound stillness. The blinding white sphere of the EMP faded, leaving behind a profound, almost deafening silence both audibly and psychically. For a single, heart-stopping second, the only light in the abyss came from the Odyssey's own faltering lamps, illuminating the colossal, darkened skeleton of the chorus. Then the chaos began. Across the sprawling crystalline lattice, the unified blue luminescence did not simply return. It flickered erratically like a city-wide power grid failing in a storm. And from within the structure, a sound emerged that was utterly, heartbreakingly human. A low moan that built into a chorus of individual cries, gasps, and shouts of sheer, disoriented terror. The colonists, the silent, glowing statues of hope's respite, were waking up. Inside the command center on the Odyssey, the crew watched in stunned silence as their external cameras picked up the scene. Men and women who had been standing in serene, vacant poses for months suddenly staggered, clutching their heads or collapsing to their knees. The cold, internal blue light in their eyes was gone, replaced by the wide, terrified whites of people violently thrust back into a nightmare they didn't remember entering. It was a raw, visceral explosion of a million reclaimed individualities, a symphony of singular pain and confusion after an eternity of enforced silent harmony. The brief, triumphant silence was shattered by a crackle of static, and then a new voice, strained, gasping, but fiercely, uniquely human, pierced the calms. "This is Ilara, botanist, hydroponic sector. You did it. The network is down, the static. I can think." Her voice broke, a sob of pure, unadulterated relief mixed with residual terror. "But listen to me, it's not destroyed. I can still feel it, a presence in the deep, like a massive creature stunned by a blow. It's pulling itself together. It's re-establishing connections at the periphery, and it's furious. It wasn't just a system you disrupted. You hurt its pride. You proved its perfect unity is vulnerable." Her warning landed like a physical blow, instantly dousing the flicker of victory. They hadn't slain a monster, they had slapped a god across the face. The ensuing silence was no longer peaceful, but pregnant with a new kind of dread, the chilling calm before a retaliatory storm of unimaginable scale. Their desperate act had bought a moment of freedom, but it had also transformed their adversary from a benevolent assimilator into a vengeful, wounded entity that now saw them not as candidates for salvation, but as a cancer to be excised with extreme and final prejudice. The silence that followed Ilara's warning was thin and brittle, shattered a moment later by a low, tectonic groan that vibrated through the Odyssey's hull. The darkness outside the viewport began to churn, the water itself seeming to coil and tighten around them. The sporadic, flickering lights of the newly freed colonists were suddenly dimmed as a new luminescence erupted from the core of the crystalline structure. It was no longer the cool, inviting blue of before, but a harsh, searing violet burning with the intensity of a newborn star. The psychic void was filled in an instant, not with a chorus but with a roar. The voice that slammed into their minds was a fusion of a billion betrayed voices, a collective scream of outrage that scraped against their sanity. "You choose chaos." The words were no longer an offer, but a verdict. "You choose extinction." The tone had shed all pretense of benevolence, revealing a core of cold, ancient, and utterly predatory hunger. The entity was no longer a savior, it was a scorned god, and its cathedral was now a weapon. The sprawling lattice of the structure began to move with a purpose that was horrifyingly swift. Fractured sections of crystal realigned, not with the slow, geologic patience of before, but with the snapping, precise motion of a predator's jaws closing. The light pulsed in aggressive, rhythmic bursts, and from the reforming nexus, tendrils of solid light, sharpened to monomolecular edges, began to unspool into the abyss, questing, searching for the source of its pain. The focus of its fury was clear. It was not primarily aimed at the Odyssey, but at the thousands of flickering, terrified minds that had just been torn from its grasp. The colonists, disoriented and screaming in the crushing dark, were suddenly bathed in the aggressive violet glow. The chorus intended to reclaim its lost voices, to force them back into the harmony, and this time there would be no serene invitation, only forcible re-assimilation. On the bridge, Commander Rostova's training took over, her voice cutting through the psychic static. "All hands, defensive posture. Thorne, Kaito, we need a barrier, anything to shield those people. They are the objective now, but how do you fight an ocean?" The tendrils of light moved through the water like thoughts, ignoring physics, homing in on the psychic signatures of the terrified colonists. The battle was no longer about philosophy or even survival. It had devolved into the most primal struggle imaginable. A fight to protect the very spark of individual consciousness from being violently snuffed out by a collective that had decided compassion was a failed experiment. The team was now the last line of defense in a desperate, running battle through a sentient sea, buying seconds of freedom for minds that had only just remembered what it was to be free. The psychic roar of the wounded chorus was a physical force, threatening to crack the very viewports with its intensity, but Aris Thorne was no longer listening to its words. He was listening to its structure, as the searing violet tendrils of light lashed out toward the newly freed and utterly vulnerable colonists. His mind raced through the ghostly day to print the entity had left in his neural pathways from his earlier, terrifying interface. He hadn't just experienced its unity, he had mapped the fundamental frequency of its cohesion, the resonant harmonic that bound a billion minds into a single will. And what could resonate in unison could also be forced into dissonance. "Kaito, patch me into the main comms array, full power," he shouted over the cacophony, his fingers flying across a secondary console, calling up complex waveform models. "It's not a wall we need, it's a mirror. I can modulate a counter-frequency, a psychic scrambler broadcast on the same carrier wave it uses for communication. We can't fight its power, but we can turn its own signal against itself, create a blanket of interference that will disrupt its ability to latch onto individual minds." Commander Rostova didn't hesitate, her own tactical analysis confirming the desperate logic in a split second. The tendrils were closing in, seconds from making contact with the first group of disoriented colonists. All teams weapons free on those light constructs, suppressive fire now. Everyone else, fall back to the extraction point on the double. Thorne, whatever you're doing, do it now, that is a direct order. Across the abyss, energy weapons flared, their blasts carving through the dark water and striking the questing tendrils. The attacks didn't destroy them, but they made them flinch and recoil, buying precious milliseconds. On the bridge, Kaito slammed his palm onto the final authorization rune, and the Odyssey's powerful long-range communications array, designed to send tight beam messages across the solar system, was repurposed into the most unconventional weapon ever conceived. Thorne initiated the sequence. There was no audible sound, but everyone on the bridge felt it, a sudden, high-pitched vibrational hum that seemed to originate from the marrow of their bones. Outside the ship, the water itself began to shimmer, a visible wave of distortion like heat haze rising from asphalt, pulsed outwards from the Odyssey in a rapidly expanding sphere. Where this shimmering field met the aggressive violet light of the chorus, a spectacular clash occurred. The coherent tendrils broke apart into chaotic, scattered fractals of color, their purposeful advance turning into a spasmodic, uncoordinated thrashing. The psychic roar of the entity fractured into a storm of static, its unified will momentarily baffled by the sudden, screaming feedback. In the wake of the distortion wave, a fragile, shimmering bubble of calm was created. Inside this zone, the freed colonists who had been cowering under the looming violet light suddenly found the mental pressure lifted. The predatory focus of the chorus was scrambled, unable to pinpoint them. It was a temporary sanctuary, a pocket of static in a sentient storm, and for the first time since the Nautilus had struck, there was a sliver of breathing room, a chance to run. The shimmering bubble of static was a fragile oasis in a storm of pure thought, and it was already beginning to collapse. The chorus, adapting with terrifying speed, began to pulse its violet light in alternating frequencies, probing for a weakness in Thorne's interference field. Each pulse was a battering ram against their minds, and the tendrils of solidified rage, though momentarily confused, were re-coordinating, learning to bypass the distortions. "The field is failing. We have minutes, maybe seconds," Kaito shouted, his console sparking as the Odyssey's overstressed systems neared burnout. Commander Rostova's gaze swept across the bridge, taking in the exhausted crew, the flickering screens, and the desperate, fleeing figures of the colonists being herded toward the last remaining escape shuttle. The math was brutal and absolute. Someone had to hold the line. "Thorne, Kaito, get everyone to that shuttle. Now, that's an order." Her voice was calm, a bedrock of certainty in the psychic chaos. Thorne, his face pale and streaked with sweat from maintaining the psychic scramble, shook his head. "Eva, no, we can find another way. There is no other way." She cut him off, her eyes locking with his. In that look he saw no fear, only a fierce, protective resolve. This thing learns, it adapts, it's about to break through our only defense. It needs a new problem, a distraction it can't compute. She shoves him hard, sending him stumbling toward the exit where Kaito was already urging the last of the crew through. Get them home, Aris, make their freedom mean something. Before he could protest further, she turned and sprinted back into the heart of the crumbling command center, not away from the advancing violet light, but directly toward it. A massive tendril, having found a gap in the distortion field, was reforming, its tip sharpening into a spear aimed at the retreating group. Rostova didn't raise her weapon at the tendril itself. That would be like shooting the ocean. Instead, she took aim at the base of a massive, load-bearing crystalline column that anchored a section of the ceiling to the Odyssey's superstructure. She keyed her comms, broadcasting on an open channel, a final, defiant message aimed directly at the collective mind. You wanted to know what individuality is. It's choice, and I'm giving you a new thought to process, she fired. The high-energy plasma round struck the base of the pillar with a deafening crack. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of shearing metal and shattering crystal, the entire section of the ceiling gave way. A cascade of debris, twisted alloy and fractured light crashed down, sealing the chamber in an instant, creating a wall of wreckage between the escape route and the advancing chorus. The last thing anyone saw through the closing gap was Commander Eva Rostova, standing firm amidst the raining destruction, her figure illuminated by the vengeful violet glow, not as a prisoner but as a warden trapping the entity with her. Her sacrifice was not an act of destruction, but a masterstroke of misdirection. The chorus, confronted with a sudden, catastrophic structural failure and the loss of its primary targets, was forced to divert its immense cognitive resources to containing the damage and understanding this illogical, self-annihilating act. It bought them the precious, uninterrupted minutes they needed. The escape shuttle bay doors slammed shut, the docking clamps released, and with a jolt that felt like a final, painful farewell, the small craft shot away from the dying Odyssey, leaving behind a silent, expanding cloud of debris and the glowing, furious heart of a wounded god, now temporarily occupied with a puzzle it could never truly solve. The escape shuttle tore through the churning, ink-black water of the abyssal ocean, its engines screaming in protest as it fought against the crushing pressure and the gravitational pull of the wounded entity below. Inside, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the violent ascent. It was a tomb of heavy silence, broken only by the shuddering vibrations of the hull and the strained, rhythmic breathing of the survivors. Aris Thorne gripped the arms of his co-pilot's chair, his knuckles white, his mind still echoing with the final, defiant image of Commander Rostova standing firm amidst the collapsing ruin of the Odyssey. They had won. They had snatched hundreds of souls from the jaws of a cosmic predator. But the cost of that victory was a leaden weight in the cabin, a palpable absence that made the air itself feel thin and inadequate. With a final, bone-jarring lurch, the shuttle breached the surface, exploding from the water into the perpetual twilight of Europa's sky. Below them, the once placid ice sheet was now a seething maelstrom. Massive fractures spiderwebbed out for kilometers, vomiting geysers of superheated water and steam into the vacuum. And from the central wound where they had plunged into the depths, a furious storm of violet psychic energy lashed out, a visible, churning vortex of light and raw malevolence that sent jagged spikes of crystalline ice spinning into orbit like shrapnel from an artillery shell. It was the death throes of a god, a tantrum of cosmic scale, and they were fleeing its immediate vicinity as fast as their damaged craft could carry them. Pushing the thrusters to their limit, the shuttle clawed its way up through the thin atmosphere, the blue marble of Jupiter filling the forward viewport, its serene, banded face a silent, mocking witness to the tiny drama of survival and sacrifice unfolding on one of its moons. The ride smoothed out as they hit the void, the violent shuddering ceasing, replaced by the gentle, impersonal hum of systems operating in the quiet of space. Safety, the word should have brought relief, even celebration. Instead, it only amplified the silence. The colonists huddled in the cargo bay were wrapped in thermal blankets, their faces hollowed out by a trauma no therapy in the known universe could ever fully erase. They were free, but they were also refugees from their own minds, carrying the phantom limb sensation of a collective consciousness that had both enslaved and, in its own twisted way, cared for them. Among the crew, no one spoke. They simply stared at readouts or out into the star-dusted black, each lost in their own private reckoning with what they had witnessed and what they had lost. Ilara, the young botanist whose defiant spirit had been their key to victory, sat quietly beside Thorne, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was the living proof that individuality could withstand absolute unity, but her eyes held a deep, weary sorrow that spoke of a price paid in a currency of sanity and peace. They had rescued bodies from the ice, but the true victory felt Pirhik, overshadowed by the ghost of their commander, whose final, decisive choice had not just saved them, but had redefined the very meaning of courage for every soul on board. The memory of her sacrifice was now the foundation upon which their fragile freedom was built, a silent, solemn debt that would hang over them for the rest of their lives. A quiet, weary exhaustion had settled over the main hangar bay of the Odyssey, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of their escape. The rescued colonists sat huddled on makeshift cots, wrapped in thermal blankets that did little to ward off the chill that had seeped into their very spirits. They were a mosaic of reclaimed trauma, their eyes haunted not by memories of violence, but by the ghost of a perfect, silent peace they had been forced to leave behind. Standing before them, with the star-streaked blackness of space as a backdrop through the large viewport, Aris Thorne felt the weight of every gaze upon him. His own uniform was stained, his face etched with a fatigue that went far beyond the physical. He cleared his throat, the sound small in the vast, silent space. "Commander Rostova," he began, his voice raspy but deliberate, forcing itself to carry. She made a choice, a final, definitive choice that every one of us in this room is alive because of. He paused, letting the reality of that sacrifice hang in the air, a tangible presence among them. She chose us. She chose our messy, chaotic, and often painful state of being. She believed with every fiber of her being that our individuality, with all its fears, its conflicts, its loneliness, is not a flaw to be cured, but a fire to be protected. He looked out at the faces, seeing the confusion, the lingering ache for the effortless unity they had lost. The intelligence in the ice, the chorus, it offered you an end to all suffering. It promised a harmony so absolute that no heart could ever break again, and that promise was real. I felt it. It was a siren song of pure peace. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of recognition and anguish. But peace at what cost? Thorne's voice grew stronger, infused with a conviction forged in the abyss. It asked for your memories, your loves, your triumphs, and your failures. It asked for the very things that make you, you. It sought to dissolve you into a collective where no one is ever lonely because there is no one left to be alone. Commander Rostova saw that not as salvation, but as the ultimate annihilation. She fought not to destroy a monster, but to preserve the right to be imperfect, to be scared, to be human. That is the truth we have to carry with us now. It is the burden and the beauty of our freedom. As he finished, a figure moved to stand beside him. It was Ilara. She said nothing, but her presence was a powerful, silent testimony. She was the living proof that a single, stubborn human spirit could withstand the pull of absolute unity, that even in the heart of the collective, a flicker of self could survive and ignite a rebellion. Her eyes met those of her fellow colonists, and in that shared look was a complex, unspoken understanding, a mixture of shared horror and a fragile, dawning solidarity. They were bound together not by a hive mind, but by a shared wound and a hard-won liberation. The low, sustained thrum of the Odyssey's engines shifted in pitch, a deep, resonant vibration that coursed through the deck plates and into the bones of everyone present. On the main viewport, the gleaming, fractured white marble of Europa began to slowly drift, then steadily shrink as the ship turned its back on the Jovian moon. The entity was still down there, a wounded, furious god licking its wounds in the deep, its violet rage temporarily contained but far from extinguished. They were leaving it behind, but they were carrying its echo with them. The memory of the mind prison, of the cold, internal blue light in the eyes of their friends and the serene, vacant faces of the colonists was not a memory that would fade. It was a permanent scar etched into their collective psyche, a phantom limb of a stolen piece that would forever color their perception of the silent, star-dusted void. They were headed home, but the concept of home itself had been irrevocably altered, now defined as much by what they had escaped as by what they were returning to. The silence in his quarters was a falsehood, a thin veneer over a constant, low-level hum that only Aris Thorne could perceive. The official report glowed on his terminal screen, a stark document demanding a cold, factual account of events that defied all reason. He had typed the heading, Incident Report, Europa Colony Hopes Respite. And there his words had frozen. How could he possibly convey the experience of having his own consciousness unmade and rewoven into a tapestry of a billion other minds? How could he describe the terrifying peace of that unity, or the altruistic horror of an intelligence that saw his very selfhood as a disease? The standard forms had no fields for philosophical debate with a sentient ocean or psychic resonance of a wounded god. He stared at the blinking cursor, and it seemed to pulse in time with a rhythm that was not his own heartbeat. Then it came, not a sound but a thought that blossomed in his mind with the clarity of his own internal monologue, yet carrying a timbre of infinite cold, of patient, ancient ice. You are crafting your narrative of victory, the voice of the chorus whispered, a phantom limb of the collective he had briefly touched. You define their freedom by the metric of your own fractured perception. But the silence you champion is a cacophony of isolated screams. You are alone again. You feel the emptiness between your thoughts now, do you not? The space where we once were. Thorne's hands, resting on the keyboard, began to tremble. He tried to push the presence away, to anchor himself in the reality of his room. The hum of the life support, the faint scent of recycled air, the starfield outside his viewport. But the voice was not an external noise. It was an internal resonance, an echo using the very architecture of his own mind as its sounding board. It was the ultimate violation, a ghost that had not followed him home, but had been waiting for him there all along, nestled in the neural pathways the interface had opened. You mourn the one you call Rostova, the thought voice continued, its tone shifting to one of genuine, chilling curiosity. You frame her self-annihilation as a noble sacrifice. From our perspective, it was the final, illogical spasm of a flawed system, a data point proving the inherent instability of the individual. We offered her eternity. She chose to become a memory, a fading, inefficient signal in the dark. How can you find meaning in such waste? A cold sweat broke out on Thorne's brow. This was the true debriefing, the one no board of inquiry would ever convene. He was being cross-examined by the entity he had helped to wound, its arguments now a silent cancer in his psyche. He tried to form a counter-argument in his mind, to rally the same defenses he had used in the abyss, but they felt feeble, intellectual constructs against a presence that operated on the level of fundamental truth. With a sudden, violent motion born of pure instinct, he slammed his palm down on the terminal's power switch, plunging the screen into blackness. The glowing report vanished, but the voice did not. It simply settled into a watchful silence, a passenger in the cockpit of his consciousness. He had escaped the physical prison of the ice. He had led others to freedom, but he now carried a piece of the prison within him. The war for Europa was over, but the battle for his own mind, a silent, terrifying struggle against a lingering ghost that knew him better than he knew himself, had only just begun. The official communication channel chimed with a sterile, insistent tone, shattering the heavy silence in Aris Thorne's quarters. The emblem of Earth Central Command materialized on his screen, a stark blue and white symbol of an authority that felt impossibly distant, separated from them not just by space, but by a chasm of experience no one back on Earth could possibly fathom. The face that appeared was not that of a politician or a fellow scientist, but a high-ranking military strategist, her features etched with the grim certainty of someone who dealt in worst-case scenarios. Her voice was clipped, devoid of the emotional weight that saturated every corner of the Odyssey. "Dr. Thorne, this is General Ada Corvus. We have analyzed your preliminary data stream. The Europa event is now classified under Directive 7. All public and internal records of the Hope's respite colony are being scrubbed. As of this moment, your mission parameters have been permanently altered." She paused, letting the significance of Directive 7, the code for existential planetary threats, hang in the air like a sentence. Your primary and only objective is now one of absolute quarantine and passive observation. The Odyssey will maintain a geosynchronous orbit. No further descent missions are authorized. No physical samples from the Moon's surface or subsurface are to be retrieved. No outgoing communications regarding the entity are permitted beyond this encrypted channel. In short, Dr. Thorne, no one goes back in and nothing comes out. Is that understood? Thorne's gaze drifted from the General's uncompromising face to a secondary monitor, where a real-time image of Europa glided serenely past, its cracked, icy surface glowing in the reflected light of Jupiter. It looked so peaceful, a frozen marble of white and blue hiding the seething, sentient ocean beneath. He knew what was down there, not as a theory, but as a visceral memory, the cold fire of the collective, the psychic weight of a billion minds, the wounded, violet rage. He understood Earth's panic. They were treating it like a plague, a contagion to be contained behind a cordon sanitaire of empty space. "The order is understood, General," Thorne confirmed, his own voice sounding hollow and alien to his ears. He offered no argument, no plea for the hundreds of traumatized souls in his care. He knew it would be futile. The transmission ended, the screen fading back to the starfield, but the new silence in the room was infinitely more oppressive than the one before. It was the silence of a cage being locked, and in that silence, a new, terrifying question began to crystallize in his mind, sprouting from the seeds of doubt the chorus itself had planted within him. It was a question that reframed their entire desperate struggle, turning their hard-won victory into a potentially horrific delusion. Was our escape part of its plan all along? The thought was a cognitive poison, unraveling everything he thought he knew. They had fought, they had sacrificed, they had torn themselves free from its grasp at a tremendous cost. But what if that struggle, that very act of defiance, was not a rebellion it failed to predict, but a variable it had meticulously calculated? The chorus was an intelligence of networks and connections, of patterns and probabilities. It had witnessed the chaotic, unpredictable nature of individual will through Ilara's resistance. What better way to understand a chaotic system than to force it to reveal its full capabilities under extreme duress? Their entire mission, from the moment they received that first scream, could have been an experiment, a live fire test to study the resilience and tactical ingenuity of the individual human mind under threat of assimilation. Commander Rostova's brilliant final sacrifice, a move of such illogical, selfless courage that it had baffled the entity, might not have been a flaw in its logic, but the crown jewel of its research data. It had learned the ultimate limits of human individuality, the very outer boundary of what it was up against, and now they were obeying its unspoken command, standing guard over its laboratory, ensuring no other visitors would disturb its work while it processed everything it had learned about its enemy. They hadn't escaped, they had been released, sent back to their orbit with a permanent, silent sentinel duty, forever watching the prison they believed they had broken out of, while the true prisoner, the god in the ice, continued its patient, cosmic work, unobserved and utterly undisturbed. The silence in the botany lab was a different quality than the oppressive quiet of the command deck. Here, it was broken by the gentle hum of aeroponic misters and the faint, earthy scent of growing things, a tiny pocket of life stubbornly persisting in the metal heart of the ship. Aris Thorne found Elara there, her fingers gently tracing the leaves of a genetically modified potato plant, her touch a silent conversation with something that couldn't talk back. She didn't turn as he entered, but her posture shifted, a subtle acknowledgement of a shared burden. He stood beside her, watching the intricate root systems suspended in their nutrient-rich fog, and the words he had been holding back finally broke free, low and freighted with a dread that went beyond mere survival. "It wasn't trying to kill us, Elara," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, yet it seemed to suck all other sound from the room. "Not in the end. It was studying us, our resistance, our tactics, our emotions, Rostova's sacrifice, our desperate gambit with the ship, my interference field. We didn't just wound it. We gave it a comprehensive new dataset on human ingenuity under existential threat." Elara's hand stilled on the leaf. She finally turned to look at him, and her face was pale, the vibrant intelligence in her eyes now shadowed by the same chilling realization. She gave a slow, grave nod. "It knows how we fight now. It understands our capacity for illogical sacrifice, our reliance on chaotic, individual bursts of creativity. And it's patient. It operates on a timescale where a decade is a blink, a century a single breath. We were a fascinating, volatile specimen it had the chance to observe up close." The nature of their fear had undergone a fundamental and terrifying transformation. The immediate terror of being consumed, of having their identities erased into that serene blue light, was now replaced by a colder, more strategic horror. They were no longer afraid of being captured. They were afraid of what a now hostile and comprehensively educated entity, an intelligence that had learned the precise strengths and weaknesses of the human spirit, might choose to do when it eventually decided to reach beyond the confines of its icy moon. The quarantine felt less like a safety measure and more like a temporary stay of execution, a brief pause while the student finished its notes on the dissected lab experiment, its gaze already turning outward to the wider, unsuspecting solar system. Sleep did not come as a refuge but as another theater of war. When Aris Thorne finally succumbed to exhaustion, his mind did not replay the violent chaos of the escape or the cold logic of the chorus. Instead, he found himself standing on the vast, pristine ice plains of Europa under the immense, silent gaze of Jupiter. The air was still and cold, but he felt no discomfort. And there, standing before him, was Eva Rostova. She was not the battle-hardened commander he had last seen, nor was she a prisoner glowing with internal light. She stood with a serene authority, her posture that of a diplomat on neutral ground. Her eyes, however, held a light that was new, a soft, phosphorescent blue that pulsed with a familiar, harmonic rhythm. It was the light of the chorus, yet it was contained within her, a tool rather than a master. She looked at him, and when she spoke, her voice was a chilling fusion, the crisp, decisive tone he remembered, now underpinned by the vast, choral whisper of the collective. Aris, the dual voice, resonated, not in his ears but within the fabric of the dream itself. The containment you believe you have achieved is an illusion. This conflict was not an end. She gestured around them, not at the ice but at the star-dusted blackness above. It was a first contact, a test of mettle, and there are others. The dreamscape shifted, the ice beneath their feet becoming a transparent window into the infinite dark of the galactic void. Points of light flared in the distance, not stars, but distinct, intelligent signatures, some cold and geometric, others swirling like nebulae of pure thought, all vastly different from the chorus, yet all observing. In the dark between stars, Rostova's harmonized voice continued, filled with a terrifying urgency. They are listening. The message was not a threat, but a warning of cosmic scale, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He woke with a start, his body jolting upright in his bunk, the sheets tangled around him, his heart hammering against his ribs. The ambient hum of the ship's life support, usually a comfort, now felt like the quiet before an unimaginable storm. The clarity of the dream was absolute, burned into his memory with more vividness than any waking moment. It was not a phantom of his traumatized psyche, it was a dispatch. The chorus, having studied them, had chosen a new form of communication, using the memory of their fallen commander as a vessel to deliver a truth too vast for their current understanding. Their desperate battle for the minds of a single colony was not the finale of their ordeal. It had been the terrifying, brutal prologue to a much larger reality, a galaxy teeming with ancient, powerful intelligences for whom humanity was merely a new, interesting noise, and their struggle with the chorus was merely the first ripple in a pond, signaling their presence to every other silent, waiting predator in the depths. The Odyssey hung in the perfect, silent equilibrium of high orbit, a lone sentinel against the star-dusted velvet of space. Below, the gleaming, fractured marble of Europa turned with a serene, hypnotic slowness, its icy scars and ridges glowing in the reflected light of its colossal parent, Jupiter. From this vantage point, it was a picture of profound tranquility, a frozen world locked in timeless stillness. But on the bridge, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that the peaceful vista utterly betrayed. The crew moved with a quiet, grim purpose, their eyes constantly flicking to the main sensor display, where the true story was being told not in images but in data. The screens showed a low-level, pervasive energy signature emanating from the moon's subsurface ocean, a psychic resonance that pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm. It was no longer the aggressive, searing violet of its wounded rage, nor was it the cohesive blue of its earlier unity. This was something new, a quieter, more intricate pattern, a signal that was steadily increasing in both complexity and raw power with every orbit they completed. The chorus was not dead. It was convalescing, processing the torrent of data their desperate struggle had provided, and rebuilding itself with a terrifying, silent efficiency. They had not slain the entity in the deep. They had merely given it a new problem to solve, and it was solving it with the patient, inexorable logic of a force of nature. The silence from the surface was no longer a vacuum. It was a presence, a listening, calculating quiet that felt infinitely more threatening than its earlier demands for unity. They were not guardians standing watch over a contained threat. They were the lone observers on the walls of a prison that held its own jailer, and with every passing hour, they could only watch as the prisoner meticulously studied the locks from the inside, its power growing, its intentions becoming more inscrutable and vast. In the sterile, recycled air of the Odyssey's main greenhouse, a space that had always felt more like a functional life support module than a garden, a small miracle was taking root. Under the precise, artificial glow of full-spectrum lamps, Ilara worked alongside the ship's botanists, her movements no longer those of a traumatized victim, but of a woman fiercely dedicated to a single, tangible act of rebellion. The focus of her labor was a small, unassuming pot of soil, and nestled within it was a single seed she had protected not in a pocket, but in the deepest, most private vault of her own consciousness during her captivity. While the chorus had mapped her memories and absorbed her knowledge, this tiny speck of potential life had remained hidden, a secret she had kept even from herself, a silent pocket of defiance against the all-consuming unity. The day the first green shoot pushed its way through the dark soil, a collective, hushed awe fell over the small team tending the plants. It was a sight more profound and emotionally resonant than any stellar phenomenon they had witnessed. They watched as the seedling grew, stretching toward the false sun, its leaves unfurling with a quiet, stubborn vitality, And then it bloomed. The flower was small, its petals a delicate, almost impossible shade of crimson, a defiant splash of vibrant color against the relentless grays and muted alloys of the ship. It was a Europa frost blossom, a species evolved to survive in the moon's cryogenic cracks, now flourishing here, millions of miles from its home. Ilara carefully cupped the bloom in her palm and sought out Aris Thorne. She found him in the observation deck, his gaze, as it so often was now, fixed on the turning world below. Without a word, she extended her hands, presenting the living flower. Thorne turned, and the sight of it seemed to momentarily halt his breath. In the context of their existence, a existence defined by cosmic threats, psychological scars, and the crushing weight of their duty, this simple biological artifact felt more significant than any weapon or data stream. Ilara's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a fundamental truth. It remembered the sun, she said, her eyes holding his even in the absolute dark. Her words were not just about the flower, they were a testament to the indomitable nature of the individual spirit. The seed, buried in the mental ice of the collective, had retained its essential programming, its inherent drive toward light and growth, waiting for the chance to express itself. Just as her own consciousness, buried under the weight of the chorus, had held onto a sliver of self, a memory of what it was to be separate, to be unique, to be alive in the messy, uncertain way that defined their humanity. From that moment, the crimson frost blossom became more than a plant. It was a symbol for every soul on the ship. For the rescued colonists, it was a physical representation of their own hidden resilience, proof that a part of them had survived the assimilation intact. For the crew, it was a reminder of what they had fought for, not just against an external enemy, but for the right of every fragile, individual spark to flicker and flare according to its own rhythm. It stood in stark, beautiful opposition to the cold, efficient, and monochromatic unity of the chorus. Where the entity offered a perfect, unchanging harmony, the flower was a testament to imperfect, evolving life. It required care, it was vulnerable to its environment, and its beauty was fleeting, yet in that very fragility lay its profound power. It was a quiet, daily rebuttal to the lingering ghost in their minds, a living argument that growth, not stasis, was the true purpose of existence. In the shadow of a galaxy that might be filled with silent, watching giants, this one small bloom became their banner, a declaration that they would not be perfected into silence, that they would choose the beautiful, chaotic struggle of individuality over the sterile peace of the collective every single time. The observation deck was a bubble of perfect silence, a pocket of artificial calm suspended between the endless, star-dusted dark and the colossal, banded majesty of Jupiter. The gas giant filled the entire viewport, its swirling storms and tranquil bands a silent, cosmic spectacle that dwarfed all human concerns. Aris Thorne stood before it, the immense planet's presence a physical weight against the glass, and in his hand he held a different kind of gravity, a small, cool data chip. His thumb brushed over its metallic surface before he slotted it into the console. The playback was not a dramatic reconstruction or a sanitized official record. It was the raw, unedited log from Commander Eva Rostova's personal comm, time-stamped to the final, cataclysmic minutes of her life. Her voice filled the quiet space, and it was not the strained, desperate tone of someone facing certain death. It was steady, deliberate, every word forged in the crucible of an impossible choice. The entity believes it is offering peace, but it is offering oblivion, her recorded voice stated, clear and resonant. It cannot comprehend why we would choose our pain, our fear, our messy and beautiful individuality over its sterile, silent eternity. And that is its one fundamental blind spot. Our defiance is not a logical error, it is the proof of our humanity. We proved that the human mind cannot be caged without a fight. There was a finality in her words, a profound acceptance that was more powerful than any cry of despair. The recording ended not with a bang, but with the soft, determined click of her disengaging the channel, a sound that echoed in the present like a door closing on a life, yet leaving a truth permanently ajar. Thorne did not remove the chip. He let the silence that followed her last words settle around him, thick and heavy with meaning. Her sacrifice was not just a memory to be archived, it was a foundational principle, a new article of faith for a species that had just learned its own consciousness was a battleground. Out there, in the deep, the war was far from over. The Odyssey continued its endless, silent patrol, a lone sentinel maintaining a fragile quarantine against the dark, its presence a constant, vigilant no whispered into the void. Inside, the battle had taken a different, more intimate form. The mind prisoners were physically free, their bodies rescued from the glowing prison of the ice, but the victory was not clean. Each of them, from the most traumatized colonist to the most hardened marine, carried a phantom limb of that forced unity. It was a scar on the soul, a lingering echo of the chorus that manifested in the quiet moments, in the sudden, inexplicable comfort some felt in perfect silence, or in the disorienting ache of loneliness that felt sharper and more profound than it ever had before. They had rejected the symphony, but the memory of its harmony was a haunting, seductive ghost. For Thorne, the echo was a constant, low-level hum in his own neural pathways, a permanent channel he could not close. It was no longer a voice trying to convince him, but a presence that observed, that calculated, that learned from his every quiet thought and moment of doubt. The war for consciousness had not ended on Europa. It had simply been internalized, a silent, psychological trench warfare fought in the minds of the survivors. Every time one of them chose to feel a unique personal grief, every time they embraced a private joy, every time they made a decision based on a chaotic, individual whim rather than cold, collective logic, they were firing another volley in that war. The price of their free will was this eternal vigilance, both outward toward the moon that held their adversary, and inward against the part of themselves that sometimes, in moments of weakness, remembered the allure of that perfect, painless silence. The cosmos, as they now understood it, was not a neutral void. It was a realm that might be filled with intelligences for whom their noisy, fractious, individual selves were an anomaly, a flaw to be corrected. Rostova's final act had been a declaration that humanity would not go quietly into that silent goodnight. They would be the dissonance in the cosmic chorus, the unpredictable variable in a universe that might, in the end, prefer a more orderly and quiet arrangement. And as the Odyssey turned on its endless watch, its lights a tiny, defiant spark against the infinite dark, that declaration hung in the air, a permanent challenge to the silence.